Okay, so let's talk about the ship to portion on the purchase order. Here we have on my purchase order, the ship to section. And you always want to make sure the name itself is the legal name of the location. So when you're creating the purchase order, you want to make sure that that name is what they use. For example, in my purchase order, you see Santa's Diner. You wouldn't want to have Santa's, equipment supply or Santa's appliance store. You want to have the name that they legally use, and you can always check their official website to confirm. And you also want to avoid abbreviations. So many times I'd get a purchase order that would say, let's say it was for, John Muir Elementary School. They would put JMES instead of spelling out John Muir Elementary School. The vendor isn't always going to know what the abbreviation means. So, for example, you could have John Muir. Not everyone's going to know what that is. Or you might have MS for middle school or HS for high school. Again, the vendor's not going to know. When in doubt, please spell out everything on there so no one has to guess, because you don't want there to be an issue at the delivering terminal. So secondly, we want to look at the address. Now, if you go to like MapQuest and you punch in 1640 Riverside Drive, you might get several entries for 1640 Riverside Drive in different cities. So you want to make sure that address is, completely correct. You want to make sure you include any sort of suite number, building number. Orders used to ship to Facebook or Meta now, and there would be on different floors. So it would have the address and then it would say second floor, third floor, whatever it was. And you want to make sure that section's correct. You don't want to have somebody guess, especially if you have it shipping on a parcel like UPS or FedEx versus a truck, which we'll get into later. But you really want to make sure that that part is right. And then next you have the city. Now, there are some cities like, San Diego. There's one in Texas and there's one here in California. Paris, Perris, that pops up in different states. You just want to make sure that your city is correct in your state. Very important. And for the zip code, I'll tell you a quick story. I had an order for a smoker, which was pretty heavy, going to South San Francisco. But when I got the freight estimate, I was one number off the zip code, and the zip code I used was for San Francisco proper. And when we got the bill for the freight, it was off by hundreds of dollars, because South San Francisco it's a lot harder for the trucks to navigate. And so a lot of vendors and carriers end up charging more to deliver to that zip code. So you just want to make sure that your zip code is good to go. Now we're going to talk about the contact information. This is extremely important, especially if you're shipping to like a hotel, for example. A lot of hotels are huge. You want to make sure you not only have the department, but the name. And I know in some systems, there might not be room to put everything. So you want to make sure that they might have like a mark for the kitchen. You would want to put kitchen dash, John Smith or whoever the chef is, kitchen dash, chef, Sally, whoever it is, right? Because you want to make sure it gets to the right person. A lot of times shipments for hotels, especially if you're shipping something small, let's say they need something right away and the box is kind of small, it gets dropped off in the lobby. I've had boxes get totally lost in the lobby, or you have several people working the lobby that day going, I didn't see a box, they didn't really sign for it, right? And you just want to make sure that it has the information, because I had one time they did find the box, and because it had the right department on, I think it was for maintenance. They need something in maintenance. They were able to get it to the right person in time. So it pays to have that information. And you also want to put a valid phone number, not necessarily the 1-800 number that somebody calls and you don't even get a live body where you just get a recording. You don't want to put that number. You want to put a number that actually goes to somebody's office or their cell number. You want a phone number that you can connect to a human being in case there's an issue with a package. And I always reference an email as well, because some people, they're not in their office, they're on the floor, they're, especially if they work in the warehouse, they're all over the place. They're not going to be at their desk all the time. So having an email is just, the more information you have, the better, because if something does go wrong, you don't want to waste time hunting down the person that the package is for. And now we're going to talk about freight on board, which is the FOB section on your purchase order. Now, FOB stands for either free on board, or where I used to work, we called it freight on board. And it talks about the ownership of the shipment. So a freight on board origin, you'll see this PO, I put destination, but let's say you had FOB origin. Okay, let's see, because that you'll see that more often actually. So you have, let's say you have your shipment in New York, right? And you want to get it to LA. As soon as it leaves their dock, you become responsible for that shipment. The vendor's out. They're like, it left our dock, we're out. That's what, because it's coming from the origin. The origin is New York. So you know that once it leaves, it's not their responsibility anymore. Now, if you see FOB destination, that means that when it leaves the factory in New York, it's the vendor's responsibility all the way to LA until it delivers. Now, I had customers that had free freight programs where the vendor was responsible for the freight from, let's say, New York to LA, and that would be free. Didn't include liftgate, which we'll talk about later, but the freight itself was free. However, their purchase order still had to say FOB origin. It still had to say that, because that way the factory could issue the invoice when it ships. Because technically, if you have FOB destination, the factory still owns that order all the way to the destination. So technically, they may not be able to invoice you when it ships. They invoice you when it arrives, and they don't want to do that. So they would insist on FOB origin. And that nowadays, it's far more common. So now we're going to talk about the ship method, or we call it ship via. Now you're going to see probably there's 3 or 4 common entries in that section. Number 1 that you'll see is prepay and add. Okay. All that means is that the vendor is going to ship your order and they're going to add the freight charges on the invoice. So they're going to go ahead and cover the freight or with the carrier, and then they're going to add that cost to the invoice. So you'll pay for it, but they're getting it out the door. And usually on prepay and add, the vendor is going to choose which carrier to ship out your order. They're going to pick most likely the cheapest one. Now, I've had some buyers say, we don't want, a certain company. They always damage our stuff. They never deliver it right. I need you to use this company. The vendor may or may not honor that, because the vendor might have a better contract with the other company. However, you as the buyer could say, look, if you're not going to ship it, maybe you can give them a couple options. Ship it via who I want. I'm going to order for someone else, because the company you use, there's a reason they're cheaper, is because they always damage everything, or whatever the reason was. So you can kind of work something out with the vendor to make sure that it ships, hopefully, with somebody that you trust. And the other option is free freight. So you'll see, it'll say prepaid. You might see free freight, or you'll see prepaid on there. And that means that the vendor is going to ship your order for free. Now, that won't include anything special like a liftgate or inside delivery or anything. We'll talk about that later. But from the vendor's location to you, it's free. Now, that's usually set up ahead of time. Usually you have to hit a dollar threshold, or you order X amount of cases. It's got to be worth it for the vendor to offer you free freight. And also, they're going to choose the vendor on free freight because it's free. You don't have a lot of say. They're going to decide. Now, you can't ask, again, please don't use so-and-so. They always damage my stuff. Or, if you're going to pick someone free, can you pick out of these ones? They may or may not do it. It just depends. But, you can always ask. And it's always good to ask. You never know until you ask. And then another version you're going to see is third party. Now, third party is when a buyer has an order and they pick the carrier. They'll say, call my third party logistics, usually a broker. A broker is someone who will take all your delivery information and they'll put it through a whole network of carriers to find the best rate and a reliable driver. Let's say it's Acme Logistics, right? Acme is going to find the buyer a great deal, a good price and everything. And the purchase order is going to say, third-party freight, please call Acme Logistics, ask for so-and-so. They're going to reference a phone number and a contact name and a quote number. So you'll see Acme Logistics. I'll just put LG. You'll list a name so they can have someone to ask for, a phone number, and you'll need an account number because the carrier has to be able to reference the account number for Acme so Acme can charge the buyer the correct rate. Because what will happen is the buyer will get a rate that say to ship from the vendor to the customer is $1,000. And that's the quote that the logistics team gave them. The buyer needs that in writing, and they need to reference that quote number on their purchase order. Because if there's an issue later on, the buyer can come back and say, hey, to the vendor, did you reference that quote number? Did you reference the right information? I mean, in the end, the buyer can work with their broker and get it worked out. But you just, again, you just want to stress that you can have as much, correct information as possible. Sometimes people say, oh, too much info is too confusing, but sometimes having that extra info that's on there that can help somebody make sure that the information's accurate is much better. And now we're going to talk about special instructions. On this purchase order, usually the special instructions are toward the bottom here, right? And it says UPS ground, delivery window, and a contact. In my experience, you want to put that type of information up here in the shipping information, this section right here. Okay. You want to have a name. You want to have a phone number. Cell phone is preferable. And you want to have your hours. And you want to see if you need a lift gate. So let me explain. When you have a delivery, let's start with a place that doesn't have set hours. Let's say it's going to a school. Usually schools, though, have things go to the warehouse. But let's say they're shipping an oven to an elementary school. Schools notoriously do not have consistent receiving hours. In fact, they really often don't really have someone that receives equipment. But let's say you have to ship it there for some reason. It's emergency. They need it to install right away. You want to make sure you specify a contact name and a contact phone number. And also you want to call for appointment. This is very crucial. It's called call for appointment. And what that does is it tells the carrier to call the name, the person, and set up an appointment within a day or two, within 24 hours. And they're going to give you a window of time, usually 4-hour window, 10 to 2, 12 to 4. Because here's what happens. And I try to explain this to people so they can kind of get it in their head so it's automatic. If a truck shows up to the delivery site and nobody's there to accept, or nobody can take delivery, they're like, hey, I'm by myself, I can't help you. That truck has to go back to the delivering terminal and then set up a brand new appointment to drive back out there again, which means you're going to have to pay a redelivery charge. And the redelivery charge is based on the weight of the item, the space or the room it takes on the truck, and the distance between the delivery terminal and the delivery site. So there have been, especially if you're like in the Tahoe area, there are resorts out there that are kind of off the beaten path. I had an order show up to a particular resort and the guy's like, oh, I can't take it. I'm like, you guys called and set the appointment. He's like, sorry, I can't take it. So the truck had to go a half hour back to the delivery terminal, half hour. And they ended up getting it redelivered. Everything was fine. But having it so it's at the delivery terminal, it comes, the shipper sends it, and it might be let's say it's in Reno. So from Reno to the resort, say it's 30 minutes. The truck has to go out there. I can't help you. I can't take the order. And it comes back to the terminal, and then it goes back out there again. So that's 3 trips. Okay. So here on my example, some people like visual. Here's Reno, and here's the resort. Let's say X. So the truck goes out there, like, sorry, we can't take it. It goes back to the delivering terminal and they make an appointment, and then it goes back out there again. So that's 3 trips that the truck is making. Okay. It should have been taken care of on the first trip, but you have 2 extra trips that truck made. That's 2 extra trips where that unit could have been damaged. And it, the less the unit has to travel, the better. So it's extremely important. If you do not have set delivery hours, usually 8 to 5, or if you know people aren't going to be there in the afternoon, or you don't know when someone's going to be there, please, please, please have a call for appointment. A lot of times you're not charged for it. Some carriers do charge for it, but it's minimal. I mean, it's so worth it. A second thing to consider, and this should be automatic for people creating purchase orders, is whether or not the customer has a lift gate. Now, a lift gate is when the truck backs up and drops the lift gate to the ground, because trucks are, up here. Like, say I was standing at the edge of a truck. If you have a pallet with an item that weighs like 400 pounds, there's no way you can get it off. So the driver will bring the pallet to the edge and they'll put it on the lift gate. It's like a metal rectangle that I think can support up to 1,200 pounds. I forget, 1,500 pounds. I forget the weight, but they put the pallet on the metal plate and they drop it to the ground. Because when it gets dropped to the ground, then you could take your pallet jack or your forklift. Well, if you have a forklift, you don't need the lift gate, but pallet jack, you slide it under the pallet, pump it up a little bit, and you wheel it off. That's what you need. So if your location doesn't have a dock, you ever gone to like grocery store and you go to find a parking spot and the place is totally packed, you got to park on the side. You'll often see the bay where the truck has to back up to deliver the food and everything. And you'll see it go down. And then I forget how many feet it is, but it's level. So when the truck's backing up, the back of the truck matches the edge of the dock so they can just wheel stuff off. You'll see that at a grocery store. A lot of places don't have that, especially the restaurant or the, cafe. They're not going to have that. A big hotel might, a hospital might, but a little school's not going to have that. So you always have to ask for a liftgate. There is a charge, varies by carrier. Some places charge $75, maybe $150, just depends. But it's so much cheaper to have the lift gate because you avoid the trips back and forth and you avoid the delivery charge. Now, if the unit's super heavy, or maybe it has to be shipped on a flatbed truck, which we'll talk about later, you'll have a forklift or you'll rent one. And then the forklift could come in because you're sitting in the seat and the forks come up automatically, go under the pallet, and you can take it off. A lot of places aren't going to bother with that. So if you just ask for a lift gate and you have a little pallet jack, you can wheel it off and take it off the truck. And it saves a ton of time.